Like when you're most you, that's when you're really connecting to these higher patterns or something. I don't
Yes,
know.
definitely. That's why I always advocate for like um not conforming to any one system of belief or committing to any idea ever. Because if you remain fluid, what you end up creating is the truest form of truth to you, which is the highest truth you can ever
Yeah,
glimpse,
it's
right?
personal. Yeah, your personal relationship with him. Like, I don't know, like I would say some ideas are better vessels for the truth than others, you know?
Yeah,
Something. But
this
yeah,
is not
yeah,
the
but
best
ultimately it's a mystery.
vessel,
Yeah.
right, to find God. I don't know why you'd find God in a soda can, but you can, and
Yep.
that's like the thing to remember is to not like if the universe presents you the soda can to understand it through, you
Mm.
know, make sure you're not like it's a soda can. Like you got to be able to be like, okay, so it's a soda can. What do I need to know? Right.
That's true as well.
You don't want to build a church around soda cans. That that would
Yeah.
it'd be an interesting idea, but it probably would not be the most effective way. But that's like I guess the value in my mind of remaining agnostic very intently, right? Is that you're always the idea of truth remains flexible and it remains undefined as such that you can always get a closer approximation of it, right? Um, Even if you'll never get a true approximation because there's no box big enough, I think you can always be further refining and getting closer to it,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, this is kind of like I don't know, it raised like the question of like um when Jesus says I am the truth, is it like, I am the closest approximation to the truth? Um I don't know, obviously it's also kind of a language thing, like what words are we using to state this? All I know I'm
Right.
not speaking Aramaic or
Yeah,
whatever language he was speaking, but
for sure.
yeah, I appreciate the agnosticism. It's very open circle vibes. It's very non-propositional,
Yeah.
non-definitional, and I really like that. I think it's super important. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
It's a weird mode of like thinking to inhabit. I don't think it comes naturally to people, but that's
yeah.
but I think that
I think it comes
when
naturally to kids.
yes,
And then
it's beginner's
we get
mind. That's
closed
what
off.
that
Yeah.
is. Absolutely.
I don't think even the divine source knows. I argue strongly that if there is a God, that God is not omniscient and not omnipotent, but is also not omniscient and not omnipotent. It's like if you ask me, well, is God
Right.
green? And I say,
Yeah.
well, no, God's not green, but he's not green either. I mean, it's just that it's the wrong kind of term
Yeah.
to
So it's
use.
like asking if God is even, and it's like no, he's not even.
Yes,
But he's not odd either. It's just
no.
like the wrong terminology. I mean, famously, Thomas Aquinas is famed for pointing out that all religious language is analogical. That is, God is not omnipotent. God is not loving. God is not powerful. God is none of these things because these are human terms to sort of approximate the kind of thing that God might be like. And maybe the only way that we really have the authority to use these as analogies is because we have like scripture using these terms, so we know they must be accurate at some level. But we have to keep in mind that God is not any of these things. These are just essentially metaphors.
You've got to actually broaden your mind to see that there are different ways of knowing things. There are different kinds of truth. Aquinas himself, who was certainly the greatest systematic philosopher since the classical era, himself had an experience one day in which he said, I have seen something which is so great and so important that all that I have written, I think by then he'd written 33 enormous volumes of philosophical attempts to come at the nature of God. All that I have written is but as chaff or straw. There are certain things that cannot be approached in this way. Metaphor is behind all our language, including very much the language of philosophy, of mainstream analytical philosophy, and of science. So
Isn't it interesting how you can see the same pattern
Exactly the same thing.
of closed
Yes.
closed surety, on either side of
Yeah. It's the same mechanism, right?
yeah,
But either side
precisely.
attributes that to the other one because they're unconscious of that in themselves,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
Saint Christopher.
Oh, the lion's dead.
Mm.
That story always resonated with me.
Oh, my dirty ass fingernails.
For non-conformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. True. True. Very, very true.
Gotta have affirmations on your surroundings, y'all.
Definitely.
Reminders. Holy boxes.
It's just about a balance, man. It's just about taking what's good and running with it, right?
To remember that it's ultimately a mystery, you know? That it's I think
Yeah, that's the important thing, right? It's just like ultimately
you know,
the truth is unknowable, right? And it's not a contest, right? There's
I
no
think we can. The whole idea of Gnostics, like the Gnostics, I think like gnosis is still a worthwhile concept, though. Like you can attain gnosis, maybe not ultimately, you know, but yeah,
What is gnosis exactly?
gnosis is like knowledge, but it's also like if you think about when Adam knew Eve in the Bible, it says,
Oh yeah,
and like so it's this intimate connection.
this intuitive like apprehension, right,
Mhm.
of like everything, and like not in a way that you could necessarily explain, but just in a way that exemplifies itself as you embody it and as you
Yeah.
trust it, right?
Yeah. I just posted a clip today about this. John Babicki talks about like the different kinds of
you?
the different kinds of knowledge and like the participatory gnosis.
The four
Um,
kinds of gnosis.
Yes. And yeah, although yeah, I think it's probably most important to stress nowadays. What you were saying is this remembrance that, you know, we never have it ultimately pinned down. You know, I'm reminded of what Gal has said in his, or what the angel, perhaps a seraphim, who, you know, like if we're taking his word for it, as I tend to do, said, you know, speaking about Christ, is that words cannot touch him. You know, like no explanation of him can be offered.
Right.
Not false, you know?
And that's I guess my thing too. I guess it's natural to assume from what I would say there that like one ought to not use the words, but that's not even necessarily what I mean. I think it's just like remembering while you're there, because what happens is you get lost in it, right? And if and this I think underpins any system of belief. It's just remembering underneath that it's like base reality is beyond us, right? Like it's like remembering that you really don't know anything, and these are just the best ways we have to talk about it, and not becoming confident in those boxes, right? Like, because you have to use the boxes to communicate, to have like nuanced discussion at a broad scale, right? And to
the only reason I hesitate is because I tend to feel that like Jesus, you know, like Christ is the like a, you know, like I feel like there is revealed truth there or something.
He is, but he's not the only one, right? He's one conception of it, and there's an argument. And again, I'm not in this world, but he was maybe even there's an argument that he's the best conception to the Western mind or the universal mind or whatever that we have now, and the way to think about it. But ultimately, in the grand scheme, like he represents an idea, right? Like there's a truth there that he gets close to, right? Or embodies, even, you can say.
Or is an incarnation of, perhaps. It's hard. You know, I'm reminded he supposedly said, you know, you shall go on to do greater things than I. So that kind of perhaps hints to, or is in keeping with what you're saying about that it's ultimately there is still a furthering or something.
Right. And, you know, maybe it's necessary that you suspend that disbelief to get close, right? I think that's a suspicion I have with religion, that's a big part of it, that like you have to have faith. And for a lot of people, that means forgetting that you're in a box, right? And falling into that way of belief and trusting it blindly, right? And I don't mean to suggest that that's a bad thing innately. But in my view, to my best estimation, the closest approximation you're ever going to get to truth is through your own understanding, and never committing to a box, but building your box from all the pieces you assemble, right?
Mm.
It's maybe and I don't mean to suggest that's the right way for everybody, but to my estimation, it seems to be the best way for me anyway.
Yeah, I'm reminded in one of Galahad's videos, he talks about this opposition of faith and gnosis, and how like this balance between the two.
There is good in the world which one cannot encounter or even perceive, unless it is accepted on faith that it's there. If you meet another person with hostility, you will find hostility in them. If you meet them with suspicion, you will arouse contempt in them. If you meet them with trust and integrity, then you will find the good in them, if it is there. And perhaps it works the same way with everything else. This idea, in my opinion, resolves the tension between the Christian notion of faith and the Gnostic concept of gnosis. Faith leads to gnosis, and gnosis reinforces faith. And it looks like, to some unknown degree, this process drives the creation of the world, and it does it by energizing whatever reality you believe in, and whatever story you give your attention to.
That seems to fit there.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard stuff to talk about.
The left hemisphere is, in a way, only aware of, only interested in what can be made unambiguous and explicit, whereas the right hemisphere is capable of sustaining things that are on the surface of them perhaps opposites, but that coexist and need one another and are perhaps at the same time in different ways present in a situation. It's also much better at understanding the implicit. For example, language, some of it is very much a part of the left hemisphere. And what is very, very largely true is that speech, the articulation of speech is in almost everybody in the left hemisphere. But that's not the whole of language. And the most important part of understanding language actually is supplied by the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is a little bit like a computer that's been given the Oxford English Dictionary and a book of rules of syntax and is trying to decode the message. Whereas the right hemisphere sees that the meaning of this is something that is not being stated, that is quite different. I mean, a very, very simple everyday example is if you're speaking in an auditorium and you say, it's very hot in here, and the left hemisphere is saying, he's pointing out that on a hot day in a room with a lot of people, it's getting warm. No prizes for that. But the right hemisphere understands what he's really saying is, could you switch on the air conditioning or open a window? So the implicit meaning is what the right hemisphere understands, only the explicit, the left hemisphere. Now, when you think about it, so much of what is truly important in language, even in everyday language, is metaphorical in nature, sometimes ironic, oblique. It may be as important what is not being said as what is being said. Poetry, in fact, is something the right hemisphere is much better at than the left, and that's because its linguistic capabilities are different from those of the left. The left are to do with narrowing down on the certainty. The left hemisphere's whole raison d'etre, if you like, is to try to narrow down to a certainty, whereas the raison d'etre of the right hemisphere is to open up to a possibility. It's seeing other possibilities. It's capable of tackling things that this very arid, we must have it clear now, is it this or is it that, will never reach. You see, it's the insistence on clarity. And I think you should be as clear as the subject matter allows, but no clearer than that. And if you try to make it clearer, you are now moving into error. You're moving away from truth towards falsehood. And the really big questions are of this nature, that they can't be clarified in that way, and they can't be made consistent with the law of the excluded middle.
The law of the excluded middle is that any proposition P must be true or false. It can't be both. It can't be neither.
Yes, sometimes not only can it be neither, but it might be both. But this is not true of the trivial. So, for example, if I had coffee this morning, either I had milk in it or I didn't. There's no sense in saying, well, it's not really one or the other. But when you get to the realm of the things we're talking about, they are manifest more by contradiction than by simple statements where the contrary is obviously wrong. It may be very true, actually, that God does suffer. I don't know. I can't limit this being. I think there's something divine in all of us, and indeed Christ himself thought that there was. I can't rule out that very odd things do seem to happen at times, that the laws, the ordinary laws of the way things are not necessarily universal in experience. I tend to think that it's important to bear both possibilities in mind, and not necessarily to have to collapse them for one or the other. That's the left hemisphere going, oh, it's got to be a very narrow, simple truth like this. It's got to be this. We should set aside these very simple-minded, almost adolescent ideas that it's got to be this, it's got to be that, and I need to know. As I get older, I realize that there are fewer and fewer certainties, and there are very few certainties in science. And knowledge of the spiritual is a kind of process, and I think you can only hope to get somewhere if you engage in it with a mind that is not closed. So, you know, in clever people go, your mind can be so open, your brain can fall out. Yeah. But actually, everybody needs to have a pretty open mind about things that they're not so clever that they can close their minds. So that's really all I'm saying, is that there is almost nothing of which we can be certain. I'm not interested in certainty anymore. I'm interested in the shape of things that speaks to me as real. And there are many things that speak to me as real. The friendships that I've had, the love I have experienced, the beauty of the natural world, the astonishing richness of what science has revealed to me about the scale and the size of the universe, about the miracle of biology. All these things are things we cannot grasp fully. And we need to get back to a place where we have more modesty and humility about what the human brain can do. It's irrational to suppose that we can rationally achieve answers to the big questions. That is a completely irrational assumption. It's a leap of faith, but not an accurate one, in my view, not a good move. We need to get back to a degree of humility. We are evolving creatures. If we evolve for millions of years from now, we could be capable of all kinds of things and know things we can't know now. I mean, what's interesting is that most scientific discoveries were simply not made by the scientific method anyway. They were made by imaginative leaps. I am not pleading for a kind of inherently wishy-washy position. As I say, I believe in being lucid and clear. People sometimes say to me, your writing is very clear. You make very difficult ideas accessible, to which I say thank you. It costs me enormous pains and a great deal of time to do that. I believe in trying to make my thinking as clear as I can. I value lucidity and clarity, but only as far as they can be applied to the question that there is there. If you bring it down to the really kind of everyday, I think we need to think differently about how we educate.
It's hard stuff to talk about. Yeah, especially,
New territory, man. It's a new frontier.
yeah, man. Good stuff.
Very good stuff.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed our conversations, man. I feel like
Yeah,
we're
Yes.
we're kind of roughing out some of this, like,
Yeah.
this stuff, right? Kind of getting into the
Yeah.
weeds a little bit.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate like this kind of thing we got going here. And,
Totally.
yeah.